Hey, my name is Joey Clary, and the author that I chose to do my author study on is Charles Chesnutt. His different stories and the meanings behind them really intrigued me. I found it interesting how he was forced to write a certain way so that his stories would sell while still adding aspects of his stories that went against those he published for. So, a little background on Chestnut. Charles Chestnut was born in Cleveland, Ohio on June 20th, 1858, to Andrew Jackson Chestnut and Maria Sampson Chestnut. Both his parents were free people of color from Fayetteville, North Carolina, who left in 1856 to find a place with greater racial tolerance. After moving around some during Chestnut's early youth, the family found themselves back in Fayetteville, North Carolina after the Civil War. In 1871, Chestnut's mother passed away. Chestnut at the time was just a boy and still in school, but once Chestnut became of age, the principal at the school, Robert Harris, gave him a teaching job. He worked there and then transferred to a school in Charlotte, North Carolina, and then finally ended up back in Fayetteville in 1877. In 1878, a year after moving back, Chestnut married Susan Perry. They had three daughters and a son. Chestnut then went on to become the principal of one of the schools in Fayetteville. After a while, he moved himself and his family to New York City, where he was a reporter for Dow Jones and Company, writing daily for the New York Mail and Express. He soon realized that New York City was not the place he wanted to raise a family. So he moved his family to Cleveland, where he wrote letters for the Nickel Plate Railroad Company's accounting department. While working there, he studied for and passed the bar exam. He then opened his own court reporting firm, which ended up being successful enough that he would be able to focus all his efforts on his writing career. So the first article that I chose is called Chestnuts, the Gopher Grapevine as Social Criticism by Theodore R. Hubbard. Hubbard understood that Chestnut had a talent for portraying the local color, and Hubbard also understood that Chestnut was primarily concerned with deep and fundamental problems in American society, as indicated by his belief in the reforming power of literature. Hubbard starts out by saying that Chestnut wished to subtly show the racism that a lot of white Americans still had for African Americans. Hubbard argued that Chestnut was not just going after the Southern whites, who no more than a few years prior were fighting to keep the African Americans enslaved, but he was also going after the racism of Northern whites as well. Hubbard notes the language that Chestnut used to describe Uncle Julius from the point of view of the first narrative had racist undertones. For example, Hubbard picks out a sentence from the Gopher Grapevine that says, "There was a shrewdness in his eyes, which was not altogether African." Hubbard mentions that the language Chestnut uses here subtly refers to the couple's racism towards African Americans, which is a little confusing if you were to read the story because just prior to that sentence, the couple refers to Julius as venerable. The story also mentions that the couple did not wish to disturb Julius. Hubbard keeps making attacks at the couple, even though in the story they have done no wrong to anyone up to that point. Hubbard also promotes that Chestnut was against the idea of capitalism and American enterprise. Hubbard believes that through his writing, Chestnut felt that Northerners had an unbounded faith that the ultimate standard of good is contained in capitalistic enterprise. Hubbard then goes on to speak about how when the couple tours the property, they ignore the beauty of the vineyards and forgo eating the sweet grapes. He also mentions that they get tired and have to sit down after only a short walk out of the buggy. He attacks the couple because he believes that Northerners are weak, unable to fit comfortably into the natural environment, and indifferent to the bounties of nature. According to Hubbard, Chestnut wrote the couple as characters to represent capitalistic Northerners coming down south after the war to take advantage of the ruins and begin business. That was not totally unheard of during the time of Reconstruction. Post-war, there were many Northern businessmen that came down and began to buy the land for cheap so that they could begin their wide range of enterprises. Hubbard also believes that Chestnut wrote the character of Marsh McAdoo as being the personification of the greedy capitalist. Yes, I think there could be an argument for that, but I do believe it is a little bit more simple than that. Slave owners were some terrible people, using slaves to make themselves a profit. So rather than using Marsh McAdoo as a personification of capitalism and greed, Chestnut was just writing about the common stereotypical Southern slave owner. Another topic that Hubbard mentioned in his article was Chestnut's use of literary realism. For example, he analyzed how Chestnut wrote about the tortures that slaves went through. Chestnut used literary realism to convey his primary message that the antebellum South was a terrible place. In this post-antebellum period that Chestnut lived in, the audience he wrote for were romanticizing a past of atrocities. Chestnut wished to make it clear that the antebellum South was a terrible place to live in. He did that by adding aspects in the stories that were what the actual slaves of that time went through. For example, in the Goofer Grapevine, Marsh McAdoo believed that some of his slaves were stealing grapes, so he had an overseer patrol at night and set traps for the slaves. Marsh McAdoo wanted to make sure he was making a profit, even if that meant keeping his own slaves in constant fear. So the next article that I chose is called Social Realism in Charles Chesnutt by Russell Ames. Ames speaks on a lot of why Chesnutt wrote in the way he did. There was great prejudice in white communities against blacks, which translated into them only wanting to read stories where blacks were not heroes. So that is what Chesnutt did. He wrote stories that did not hold black characters in high, unreasonable esteem. He wrote his characters using social realism. His African American characters were never the perfect human beings. They were always realistic. They had realistic emotions and made realistic decisions. For example, in The Wife of His Youth, Mr. Ryder had a real internal and emotional struggle in deciding what he should do, whether to take his wife back or to forget her and move on with his life. That internal struggle was something that was very realistic and showed us the true character of Mr. Ryder. And that is how Chesnutt was able to sell his works. By making it so that his characters were realistic, racist readers still bought his writings because they were all right with not seeing black characters be better than white characters. Another thing that Chesnutt did to be able to make his stories sell was that occasionally he would make concessions to the racists that were his readers. He would throw in very kind and well-meaning white people into his stories, as well as disreputable black characters. Because Chesnutt added in these conventional scenes and stereotypes, he was able to get his white racist readers to loosen up and not be on edge while reading the stories. That can be seen in the Goofer Grapevine with the couple that approaches Julius. They approach him very kindly, wishing not to disturb him and wanting to share the bench with him. By understanding his audience and making some concessions in his writing, Chesnutt was able to sell his work to all sorts of people, which he took advantage of. Now that he was able to get his writings out, he was able to subtly push the information he wanted to say through literary realism. Chesnutt understood that it would not be possible to destroy racism in America head on, but it had to be subtle, continuous blows that would end the racism. That is why he wrote stories about the antebellum South, including some literary realism to help persuade the mind of the racist over time. If he were to write in direct criticism of racism in America, his works would not have even gotten published, but it also would not have even be read, or if it did, it would be ignored. Over time, he believed that he could change the people's minds by getting them to understand the true horrors of life that the African American slaves faced. So the last article that I chose is called The Significance of Charles W. Chesnutt's Conjure Stories by William L. Andrews. This article again speaks on Chesnutt's use of literary realism to sneak his main points into his stories, but it also talks about how Chesnutt was able to get there. Andrews mentions that in 1889, when Chesnutt's stories were published, his publishers did not make any mention of Chesnutt's race to the readers. Though this may have been done solely so that his stories would sell more, it also helped Chesnutt's cause in trying to reform American racism. People do not enjoy being told what is right and what is wrong by others that do not share the same ideas as them. So, if readers were started to finally understand what Chesnutt was trying to say, they may have accepted it better than they would have if it was known that Chesnutt was a black author. The article also talks about how Chesnutt wrote his stories. It mentions that during the time that Chesnutt was writing dialect was extremely popular with northern whites. They were so intrigued about the South during the time of slavery, and they romanticized it. They loved to read stories about lives that were simpler and slower paced than their own. The article also talks about how good Chesnutt was at writing about the Southern traditions. At one point in the article, it says that one could learn more about the Southern traditions and grape culture from Chesnutt's works than if one were to read papers solely on that subject. Because Chesnutt wrote in this way, it made his work very popular. Overall, Chesnutt wrote to make a point, whether that was about northern businessmen coming down and taking advantage of the ruined South, or if it was about stopping racism in the United States. Using literary realism, he was able to subtly get his point across to the unsuspecting reader. While reading his works, I was able to see that there were some aspects of literary realism, but after reading the articles I presented, I learned a lot of why he did it and just how deep some of his points were embedded in his stories. After studying him and his works, I have found I enjoy his works even more than I did before. And then those are the references that I